All right, then let's get this started. Welcome to the last session of the day. Yeah, actually the last one that holds you from going to the weekend. So I will not make this too long, but I think it's a super important topic and something we discover with a lot of customers that this topic about Azure AD applications is quite unknown. Actually, everyone has kind of situations to deal with it, but no one really understands what they are doing. And this is why at some point I put together this session that explains a little bit what Azure AD applications are, why they are needed, what they are used for, and this is what this session is all about. So the idea is really to lift you from, let's say, level 0 to level, I don't know, 150, 200 maximum, to give you kind of a kickstart into the applications that can live in your Azure AD directory service. Now, just to give you like some buzzwords you might have heard already. Oh, my mouse is gone. There we are. So this is what it's all about. So you always hear these terms: enterprise application, service principals, or SCIM, managed identities, OIDC. All of these buzzwords are somehow hidden in this, let's say, main term Azure AD applications. And some of these are pretty complex beasts, I have to say. So we cannot cover everything today in those 40 or so minutes. Today, we will really focus on the basic understanding of app registrations and enterprise applications. So this is the main focus of today's session. All right, so I will be with you in the next 40 or so minutes. My name is Marcel. I work for SoftwareOne. I'm with SoftwareOne for 2 years now, and I lead a team that's sitting and operating out of Switzerland here. And we help customers, Swiss and also international global customers, on their way to the cloud. May it be Azure, may it be M365. So everything Microsoft Cloud is in our focus. And beside my day work, if I want to ensure that I really deserved to go into the weekend, I do presentations every now and then, preferably on a Friday late afternoon, such as today. All right, good. Now, before we dive into app registrations and enterprise applications, I want to give you some background why these elements are actually needed. And I mean, when I started to learn about these, I really had this problem to find an initial starting point. So why is this actually really needed? And this is why I put together some slides that explain how authentication worked back in the old days, and sometimes, well, still today. And then how Azure AD really assists you in building authentication the very modern way, the way it should be today. Right? So this is first the not so modern way. I didn't want to name it the legacy way because it's still around for some apps, but I call it the not so modern way. So imagine you have a browser and you want to consume a web application, right? So the internet is around for a long time, and let's say back in the days I wanted to use a mail application, whatever it is, Hotmail or something like that. Then I went to some URL, and before I could use this application, I had to create a user account. So create a user account, username, password, something like that, add some personal data. And then my account was created in some user database that was only available for that specific email application. So for Hotmail, for instance. So I could use it to log into my mailbox. I could then, receive and send emails. And that was more or less it. All right. So whenever I wanted to use the app, I had to log in with my login one that was available for this email application. Now, if I consume the second application, for instance, a picture or photo printing service, this was totally unrelated to the email application provider. And so the photo printing service also had its very own user database. So if I wanted to use that, I also had to create a dedicated user account for the photo printing service. And when I wanted to use that, I had to log in using my login credentials too, right? So I had two login credentials, one for app A, one for app B. And of course, we not only had like two, but maybe 20, 30, 40, 50 apps with lots of various accounts that could be used for one single application, right? So this is okay. This sometimes still happens today, especially in a consumer world, but it starts to getting painful if you want to combine some of these services together. Now, as you can see in this example, I have a storage app where I store my photos, so my pictures. This is one account I use to log in there. I can upload my pictures, everything. But now, every now and then, I maybe want to print one of my pictures. And for that, I have the second application, which is the photo printing service, right? And so that means I now somehow need to find a way how to bring my pictures that live on one service to the other service to let them print and ship it to my home. Now, there are several ways to do that. So the painful way is this, where I go to the storage app where all my photos are stored. I just download the pictures I want to print, let's say to my computer, right? And then I log into the photo printing service and upload the pictures. So this is okay if you do this every now and then, but if you use this very often, such as multiple times a week, every day, or maybe even multiple times an hour, which will not be the case in this scenario probably, but there is scenarios today, especially in the business world, where you need this multiple times an hour, right? And this will not be useful. So this was the very old way. And then at some point, the application providers, they had some great idea. And they said, look, we give you kind of a shortcut, which means if you log into the photo printing service app and you are there, we give you this option to give us the credentials so that we can log in to your storage app directly, right? So that meant that I had to store a username and password for my storage application in the photo printing service so that they could then collect the photos I wanted to print directly from there. Now, the problem is a little bit, if I give my credentials to someone, well, I'm not sure if I want to trust the photo printing service and the owners behind this. Totally, because if I give my credentials out to access my photos, who can guarantee that they will only really download the photos that I want to print and not everything? And who guarantees that they don't do anything else, right? Of course, they guarantee this in the terms of use and everything, that they're really trustful, but those kind of flows, well, they should make you really uncomfortable, right? Especially also if the photo printing service gets compromised, my login for the other apps are also stolen and can be misused, right? So they are leaked. All right, so this is a little bit the old world. Now, talking about the new world, this is where IDPs come into play, so-called identity providers. And what they allow is they allow us to somehow centralize the management of our user accounts. So imagine I'm still using the same three apps, but all of these three apps are capable to use the same identity provider. Now, what that would mean is that I would have one single login living in one identity provider and then get access after successful login to all three applications, right? So I have one identity, I have to log in only once, and then I can access all of my applications. This is actually the scenario where we want to go to, because from a usability perspective, it's best. I have to log in once. I don't have to remember 50 different passwords, because the more passwords you have, the higher the risk that you will store your passwords in a way that is not appropriate, right? And then, of course, the second factor here is when you have just one identity, that means that you also only have to protect one identity. So you can apply certain protection features such as multi-factor authentication, those kind of things, to really protect my account, right? To bring the security to a very high level, and then that is protected. And with that, also the access to all my applications is much better protected compared to having 50 different accounts, and every application platform offers various and different protection features to protect my account. So this is not good. So this is a very good approach. All right, so I log in once, and from there, I then get access to all my applications. This is what we actually want. All right. So that said, we have the last scenario to cover, which is, well, what if I want to combine using services? So again, how can I now allow the photo printing service to use the storage app to get my pictures? This also works through this central IDP. In this way, so I log into my IDP, I then connect to my photo printing service, right? And from there, I could say, well, I want to give the photo printing service access to my pictures, right? And that means I need to create a so-called delegation so that the photo printing service can now connect to the IDP and get a so-called security token that then allows the photo printing service to authenticate against the storage app service. So I need to configure a delegation. I give the photo printing service specific permissions on my storage app service, saying, well, you can go there, but you can just, for instance, just read photos. You cannot upload anything. You cannot delete anything or change anything. You can just read. And also, when you connect there, you can only access certain pictures, not all of them, but only the ones that I specifically marked to be available for you, photo printing service, right? And that said, this is a much more secure way because I don't need to have additional accounts. I don't need to have my identities somewhere stored in the photo printing service. And that's the important thing. So my username and my password and everything that belongs to my identity is always stored in the IDP only. Photo printing service does not know about anything. You'll just contact the IDP and we'll get that token to then authenticate to the storage app. I will show this in detail in a second. But this is the modern way how application usage and authentication and authorization should look like. Right? All right. Now, when we talk about this, it's important to understand two terms. One being authentication or auth-n, and the other being authorization or auth-c. So first, authentication. This is a so-called proving process where I prove that I am really Marcel, right? And how do I do that? Well, for that, I use my credentials, which is username and password that no one else but me knows, right? And hopefully it's not only that, hopefully it's a stronger proving process where I have to use MFA or an authenticator app, such as my mobile phone where this is installed, so that I need to submit username, password, and some second factor, because then the proving process is stronger and better, right? So the quality is much higher and the security is much better. All right, now talking about the Microsoft Identity Platform or Azure AD, this proving process or the authentication process can be built based on two standards. So one being OpenID Connect and the other one being SAML. They work differently. At the very end, both support this authentication process for an application scenario that I showed you before. So as you can see here, OIDC is, let's say, the newer one that is mainly used for web and mobile apps. SAML these days is very often used together with a third-party identity provider such as ADFS that you might also know when you heavily work with Azure AD and web applications. So this is for authentication. And now the proving process is done and I'm identified as a person, I'm identified as Marcel, right? Now in the second step, Marcel needs to get some access to some applications, right? For instance, and this is what we call the authorization or auth-C process. This is for granting permissions to an already authenticated person, right? And it doesn't necessarily need to be a person, because not only humans have identities, but also machines or services. They also have identities. So it's not only about people, it's also about services, devices, and so on that can have a proven identity so that they can then access something, right? Good. Now, this granting process means that it clearly defines where I can connect to and what exactly I can do there. So what areas of an application I have access to and what I can do with the data. If I, again, can just read it or if I can also delete it or whatever, right? Now, this process is built in Azure AD based on the OAuth 2 standard. Right. I will talk about that a little bit later. But this is important to understand. First, we authenticate. Once the platform or someone knows who I am, I can then be given proper access to applications, data, and can then start working. Now, in the background, both of these processes are based on tokens, right? Talking about Azure AD, there's two types of tokens. And this is not only for Azure AD, but today we mainly focus on Azure AD, so I will always use this example. So we have so-called identity tokens and access tokens. And as you can see, identity tokens, as the name mentions, is to prove an identity, right? So it's used to identify someone. And as I said, it can be used to identify a person. It can be used to identify a machine in theory, right? It's mainly used for persons. And then there's access tokens, and access tokens are used for authorizing someone to get access, right? And what's very important is the identity token contains information that identify, for instance, me as a person. So it contains my name or my email address, something like that, right? Because I need to be identified somehow. Whereas the access token does not contain anything about my person, right? So you can imagine this very easily if you imagine going to a vacation. I actually have a vacation very soon, so this is a very good example. So if you check into a hotel, this is exactly how this works. So you go to the front desk, and the first question you get asked is, well, please show me your ID. We need to identify you, right? So you hand over your ID or your passport, and someone checks, all right, so this is really you. Do you have a reservation? Yes, you do. So everything is checked, and you are identified as this person that has a reservation, right? And this is normally only done once during your stay, at the moment when you arrive. And the result of this registration process or this identification process is that at the very end, you get a key card to your hotel room, right? So at the very end, you get your key card, and then you leave the front desk and go to your hotel room. And with that key card, which is comparable to the access token, you can now get access to exactly one single room, to your room, right? And this key card does not contain any information about yourself. It's not written, let's say, in digital form that this key card belongs to Marcel. It just says this key card opens room 205 from today until October 20th, because that's the date when I will leave, right? This is the access token. And whoever has the access token can get into the hotel room if he knows where the card actually works, in what room it works. All right, at the very end, if you check out, you hand the access token back to the front desk, it gets deleted, and you don't have access anymore. And this is exactly how it works in the IT world. First, you identify, then you get some access token, and then you're allowed to do something. All right. Now, as I already said in the schema, in the overview, you need someone that manages all of this, and that's the identity provider. So the triangle we have seen in the first diagram, right? As I said, we now talk about Azure AD because that's, I would say, the most important identity provider out there today when we talk about cloud-based authentication. So Azure AD contains a set of services and possibilities that allow you to drive and control this full process about authentication and authorization, right? And if you ever worked with Azure AD, you know that well, it offers a vast amount of options, such as MFA. So for the identification process, you need to use a strong factor, and you can tightly control when this is needed, if it's always needed, or just in certain scenarios. That's up to you to decide. We have conditional access, where we can exactly, during the identification process, first identify, well, what user is actually authenticating, and during that process, we can also test certain additional signals, such as, well, I want to know what location this user is connecting from, what country this user is connecting from, or I want to know what device this user is using. Is he using a mobile device, just a mobile phone, or is he using a full-blown desktop? Is this desktop managed by our organization, or is it an unknown device? All of this can be taken into consideration before we make a final decision if the user can be authenticated or not. That's up to you. And as we have seen in the first picture, the idea is that in the very end, Azure AD is our single identity store. That's the dream scenario where you have one single identity living in Azure AD, and all the applications out there that you're using are able to talk to Azure AD to potentially give your user account access to use these applications, which means I have a single account out in the cloud. I log in just once, and with that single account, I can get access to all the Microsoft Cloud applications, such as SharePoint, Teams, OneDrive for Business, Exchange, whatever, Dynamics, but then also to third-party apps that can talk to Azure AD, such as Gmail, Google Docs, or Salesforce, or those applications that also live out in the cloud. And everything is authenticated through a central platform. This is what we want to have in an enterprise scenario. And this is what makes Azure AD so valuable, because it's super flexible, and it really covers a very broad set of scenarios to talk to various app offers, as we have seen, various common protocols to really make it as flexible as possible. All right, so Azure AD obviously creates tokens, identity tokens, access tokens that then give us access. Now, just to let you know, I will not go into super details here, but these tokens, they have a limited lifetime, right? So again, if you refer again back to the hotel key card, well, this works today, but not necessarily in 5 years, because it has kind of a termination date, which is normally the day when I leave the hotel. So then the token doesn't work anymore, or the key card doesn't work anymore. All right, but then there's also a process that allows us to refresh tokens, because what we also don't want is that people need to log in every single hour again, right? That doesn't make sense. Well, from a security perspective, it maybe would make sense. From a usability perspective, it would not be good, right? And this is actually, we need to find some balance between a secure but still very usable way of authentication and authorization. All right. Good. Now, as I said, we want to talk a little bit about app registrations and enterprise apps today, and we start with the type app registration. Now, imagine you run an application where you want to use the processes we just discussed. So we want to ensure that only authenticated people get certain access to our application. Now, when we want to use Azure AD as our authentication provider, we somehow need to create a link between Azure AD and our web application, right? Because the web application now needs to know, all right, if someone wants to connect to my application, I need to redirect him into Azure AD to authenticate there, and then the user comes back, and as a web application, I now know that the user is authenticated, and I can authorize him properly to access the website and give him the permission that he or she needs, right? So this is what app registrations are used for. So apps that are under our control, and we want to actually attach to Azure AD to control authentication too. All right. So let's see how this looks like. So there we are. We are sitting at our computer using a browser. On the right-hand side, you can see the web application, and we can see Azure AD as our identity provider. Now, as I said, before a web app can actually delegate the authentication process to Azure AD, we need to somehow connect these two because they don't know about each other, right? And so we need to establish kind of a trust between the web app and Azure AD. And this is done by creating an app registration in Azure AD saying, well, I now know about the new application, which is Web App 01, and this is how the application works, right? And so Azure AD trusts the web app trusts Azure AD, and now we have the setup ready so that the following process works. So imagine this has been set up, and then I'll connect from my browser to Web App 1. And this web app is configured to require authentication, right? Now, because the web app has delegated the authentication process to Azure AD, the web app will tell me, well, thanks for connecting, but before you can get access to web app, you need your hotel key card, right? You need to get yours at the reception desk. So please go back to Azure AD and authenticate there. And so my browser is redirected into Azure AD. So now I get the Azure AD login prompt. I enter my username and my password. And then an identity token is created for me, right? Because I'm a person, I authenticated as Marcel with my username and my password. So an identity token is created. As you can see here, Azure AD signs the identity token. This is used for the proving process afterwards. All right. Now what happens, as you can see, once I authenticated as a person, a cookie is placed on my computer, which is down here, which is C1, so cookie 1. This is the authentication cookie that has been created to reconnect back to Azure AD. It cannot be used for the web application. This is a cookie just between the browser and Azure AD, right? Okay. Now what also happens, I'm now redirected back to the web application, right? All right, there we are. So going back to the web app now verifies if I'm allowed to do something. So it will extract the access token, will analyze who I am, what I am, and then give some access to my access token and directly, obviously, to me and my browser, right? And now I can access the web app. And at the same time, because I'm now also authenticated against the web app, you can see down here, I get another cookie, C2, which is used between the browser and the web app. So it has some information that I've been authenticated successfully to Web App 1. So this is the authentication process. Looks quite complicated. If we just go to a website, log in, and they're just there, it's much more simpler, but in the background, it's quite a complex process. Now imagine there's a second web app I want to use. I still have these cookies, C1 and C2, and I now navigate to web app 2. And web app 2 is also configured to use Azure AD, right? So that means I am again redirected to Azure AD, saying, well, you need to log in there. Now, luckily, we already logged in before. So that means during that redirection, we hand over cookie 1 to Azure AD, which means, hey, Azure AD, I'm already connected. I'm already authenticated, I'm sorry. That if this cookie is still available, Azure AD does a so-called non-interactive login in the background. So it logs me in without me entering something. So there's no need for me to enter username and password again, because I'm already authenticated through submitting this cookie 1. And now what happens is Azure AD creates a new access token then to access web app 2 for me, right? So this additional access token now contains all details that are needed to get certain access to web app 2. And again, when I get access, web app 2 places a session cookie for this web app on my browser, which is used when I will later, maybe in half an hour, return to web app 2. I will already have the authentication cookie that is still, or might be still valid, so I can access web app 2 again without authentication. Same is true if I go back to web app 1, I still have cookie 2 for web app 1, that allows me to authenticate automatically, right? All right, so let's have a quick look how this looks like. So switching back to the Azure portal, there we are. All right, now, just quick overview. As you can see, I have 2 apps here, and I will just show the second one. So app 02 auth. This is a web application that lives in Azure, but it could actually be anywhere. But in Azure, it's just simpler to show because running a web app in Azure has a very tight integration to Azure AD, so configuration is very simple and transparent. So if I'm sitting here, you can now see that in this web app, I have my URL up here, right? And I can configure authentication because I want to define, well, how should authentication work before someone can get access to my web application? If I go to authentication, you can now see that I already added an identity provider here. So that means I created a trust between my web app and Azure AD. Right? And for that, I had to register an app registration. All right, this app registration lives in Azure AD and it has some unique identifier, which is this app or client ID. This is the ID of the application I already did. Now let's have a look at this. So going back to Azure AD, I have this app registration section here where I have certain applications. And as you can see, one is app 02 auth. So this is the one you can see. This is the 77E5. This is the application ID that that was used to reference from the web app here to this app registration. All right, so if I go in there, this is actually the, let's say, the trust relationship between the web app and my identity provider. And it allows a lot of things to be configured. As you can see, I can configure branding details, so I can give my app some name to immediately identify the application. I need to define the homepage URL if it's a web application, so that I immediately know where the application lives, right? I could add additional details for this application, such as, well, internal notes or privacy statement, those kind of things. All right, then I have the authentication section, which says, well, first off, if the user authenticated against Azure AD, and Azure AD creates a token, where can this token be used afterwards? And we want to really limit this this usage field of the token to a very minimum. And this is why the redirect URI is used, saying, well, the token is automatically sent back to this endpoint of the application, and it can only be used there. So the token that Azure AD creates cannot be used anywhere. It can only be used at this specific endpoint. This is where the application waits for the user to come back saying, all right, I'm back from Azure AD. Here is the access token that I received, right? So the application needs to wait for the token to be submitted to this URI. All right. Now next, down here, you can see this is for an identification process. So I identify myself as a person. So I want this to be a so-called ID token. And as you can see, there's this other token type, which will be access token, which is used for other scenarios. And also very important is this. So who can actually use this application? Is this only a so-called single tenant app, which means only user accounts that live in my tenant, in my Azure AD can authenticate? Or is this an application that I want to also make available to other customers that have their own Azure AD environments? Then it would be a multi-tenant application. Right now, in my case, I said, well, this is a single tenant app. Only users from my Azure AD can authenticate and then get access to the applications. Other ones cannot. Right? So this really depends how you want to make your application available, if it's just for your internal employees or if it's also for external parties. All right. Then depending on what I want to do with the apps exactly, you can see I can create client secrets and certificates that can be used to authenticate as the application. This is used in certain scenarios. I can configure how the tokens should look like. So what information should be stored in the token, right? By default, the token has a predefined set of so-called claims, and I can add additional claims. So for instance, if my application needs to know what, for instance, department I work at in this company, then I could add an additional claim and say, well, I also want to add the department from the user account from the authenticated user in the access token, because that will then be used in the web app to give, let's say, HR users different permissions compared to sales users, right? And for that, I might need the department value. Then I can add that as a claim as well. All right. I can also define the owners, so who can actually manage this application registration. As you can see, this is just one user who is, let's say, the owner of this application registration object. All right, so this is configured. Now let's see how this looks like. If I go back to the app, this is all configured. So let's go to the URL of the application. I'll just copy this out. So this is the app URL, so it's a default URL. And let me now go to another browser window. So in here, I just paste this. Now this brings me to the web application. As you can immediately see, I'm now redirected to an Azure AD login. So this is now my Azure AD. So I was already redirected, and I can now log in. See what the password is. There we go. This should be it. All right. Now, as you can see, because my Azure AD enforces my users to use MFA, this is also MFA protected. So let me MFA approve this. Done. Now I'm connected to the app. And as you can see, very boring. This is the very default application that is available when you deploy new app service. But we have seen the authentication process before has now been delegated into Azure AD. And we really can control what's happening there. If I go into incognito window, so just to show you this as well, I go to the same website. But now I use some other user, so my private user. This user is not related to my tenant here. So this is a totally different user account, right? So I can still log in. MFA as well. There we go. Want to stay in, yeah. And now I get this error message that says, well, user account Marcel, Zehner at outlook.com does not exist in tenant marcelzehner.ch and cannot access the application. Remember, this is because I configured this application to be a single tenant app. So only users from my home tenant can actually authenticate and use the application. This is another user that tries to authenticate, and he actually entered correct credential details. But as I don't allow this on my app registration, authentication is not possible. So this allows me to exactly control who can authenticate, and then later in the application what permissions these person get. All right, let's go back. Good, so this is the app registration element. Now there's another element or another application type. This is the so-called enterprise application. This is a bit more confusing, I have to say. And as you can see here, an enterprise app represents an application in your tenant. So I think this is more or less the official explanation of Microsoft what this is, but it's really hard to understand what it means. So forget about this and have a look at this diagram here, because this is what it is. So remember, this is the setup we had in the first demo. So we have our web application on the left-hand side, and we delegated authentication to Azure AD by creating an app registration. This has been shown in the first demo. This is not related to enterprise apps yet. But now what happens, this app registration generates an instance of the app registration in my own tenant, which is then the so-called enterprise apps. So this is the instance of my app registration in my tenant. So there's a relationship between the app registration and the enterprise app. Now, what actually happens when I created the app registration for my web app, it also automatically created an enterprise application, because the enterprise application allows me now to control what exactly can be done in my tenant when using this app, right? Now, very often when we talk about cloud apps, you don't run the applications yourself, right? But you just consume an application that someone else sells to you, right? So let's say you use SharePoint Online. That means you don't run the SharePoint application. You just consume it from Microsoft. If you use Salesforce or any other application out in the cloud, any SaaS app, you don't run the app yourself. You just consume it. And that means this is then a so-called multi-tenant app that someone else registered somewhere, for instance, in their Active Directory tenant, and you as a consumer are just consuming the application. So as you can see here on the right-hand side, you have this foreign tenant, which is consuming the app on the left-hand side. But as a consumer, we have no control over the application itself. We don't run it. We don't know where it's running. We're just consuming it. And if we do that, an enterprise application represents this application in our tenant so that we can control, well, who in our tenant can use this application? What can this application do in our environment if that is needed? Those kind of things. So that means an app registration for an app exists one single time. So every app is registered in one single tenant. But if the app is set up as a multi-tenant application, it can be used in various tenants, and it is then represented with an enterprise application object. All right. So as you can see in the right-hand scenario, I don't have an app registration for this app I'm consuming. I just have the enterprise app. Okay, now using this enterprise application, I can control this app. And as you can see here, I can again also define, well, who can manage this application object in our tenant. I can, for instance, assign users and groups, which means I can control who is allowed to use this app. Maybe I don't want anyone in my tenant to use this app, but only a specific group of people. Then I could control that. If the application allows, I could also configure single sign-on, which means my users only have to authenticate once in my tenant, and then can also get access through this enterprise application object to this application that lives outside of our environment. Right. As we've already seen, I can implement conditional access. I can give this enterprise app additional permissions if that is needed. So if the application needs some delegated access to my environment, I could also do that. And then there's also certain more advanced scenarios. All right, now let me show you this as well. So going back here, and I will now connect to an application for the very first time. So from my tenant, I now go to this app, which is an app that me and my speaker colleagues very heavily use. Doesn't matter what it really does. This is for managing sessions and speakers if you plan or a conference or something, or if you want to speak at the conference. And as you can see, of course, you can only use this app if you log in. Right? So if I go to login now, this app offers me certain things. So first, I can create a classic login. Classic login means I would just create a username and password the old style way that lives in Sessionize. Or I could use any social provider or maybe also Microsoft, which means Azure AD. In this case, I will use Azure AD. Office 365. Now, as you can see, same thing. I'm now redirected to Azure AD, right? I now log in with my credentials. Now, Azure AD does not know yet who will log in. So first, it analyzes, well, what is the domain at marcelzehner.ch? This is called the realm discovery process. And now you can see once I added this, I'm now redirected to my specific instance of Azure AD, which contains my nice background. Now I enter my password. Again, MFA. Here we are. And finally, I'm logged in. And now comes the most important thing that asks me, well, if you want to use this app and integrate this app with your tenant, you need to accept certain permissions that you need to delegate to this app. So this app needs some permissions in your environment to actually be able to log you in using your Azure AD account. So for instance, the application needs access to your basic profile. So that means it needs to read my first name, my last name, my email address, right? And depending on the application, this list will be shorter or longer. So this is a very critical process here because I'm now offered, well, do I want to allow this or not? If I just click accept, that permissions is now delegated to the application, and the application can now access certain of my information. As you can see, I'm logged in. Up here, you can see I'm logged in as Felix. And if I go to my profile, it also already read some information from my profile. So as you can see, first name and last name has already been pre-populated. I didn't do that. So I delegated the app the permission to access my profile in my environment. And it obviously collected that information and already added it to my profile here. So this is not sensitive or not so sensitive, but you have to have a very close look what permissions you actually delegate, because some applications require you to delegate massive permissions, such as access your data anytime, for instance. And that's not really something you want. So that means this consenting process that we have just seen is very, very sensitive. And you should really configure your Azure AD in a way that you know, well, who can actually grant these consents and who cannot, right? So this is otherwise really a security issue. All right, now going back to Azure AD to close this demo. If I go back to Azure AD, I can now see I have this enterprise applications section. And if I go in there, Sessionize should now be visible in here. So let me search for it. I didn't show you before, but this was not there before I first connected to Sessionize a minute ago. You can see created today. I can now open Sessionize. And remember, this is a representation of the application that lives somewhere else, right? I can still configure it now. So for instance, I could say, well, who are the owners? So who can manage this object? No one. So I'm a global admin now, so I can still do it, of course. I could now, for instance, select, well, which user can use this application. So in here I see, well, Felix obviously already used this app. No one else did. And I could now assign this app. Now, the idea of assigning this application to certain users is that under properties, I can also select, is assignment required? So can this app be used by just everyone or only by users that are specifically assigned to this enterprise app? So now everyone can use it in my tenant. I could say, well, I want to control this. If I say yes, only the users that are in this list will actually be able to access the application. So I have more control. All right. Then, as you can see, I can implement this application into my conditional access rules to really tightly control who can access and what the requirements are for authentication before I get authorized to use the app. So this is the other element that lives in Azure AD. So not the same thing, but still these two elements, app registration and enterprise app, are closely related, right? All right, I'm already over time, I just saw. So I would say that said, I hope this gave you some insights what these Azure AD applications are used for. As you've seen, we scratched the surface now a little bit, but I hope it's a good kickstart for you to now dive a little bit deeper yourself into this application world in Azure AD. It's heavily used, and we see, as I said in the beginning, the intro, many customers are somehow using these elements, but no one actually really understands them. They don't understand what operational task these elements are actually bringing with them. And I think it's really important to understand and also to invest some time into this topic to ensure that you have a control and also, very importantly, a safe environment where your applications are living in. So that's it. That's it for now. I hope that was what you wanted to hear or what you expected. I'm still here for taking a few questions. If you don't have any questions, enjoy the weekend and hopefully see you at the next Cloudeight Summit in, I don't know when, next year probably. But enjoy the weekend and see you soon. Bye-bye.